Welcome to the Iowa Ag Podcast, where we talk about the nuanced topics of agriculture and try to bridge the urban-rural divide. I'm your host, David Geiger, here at the Jethro's Barbecue Studio. Happy to be here to start up a conversation about important issues on and off the farm. This is the Iowa Ag Podcast. Welcome to the Iowa Ag Podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger, and we are starting up a new podcast, revamping a podcast here at the folks with the Iowa Ag Podcast here. And we're going to do a conversation just on agriculture, have a conversation on what's going on in agriculture, what are some of the important events and some of the important impacts that are going on around the country, but specifically affecting Iowa. And to do so, it's a great opportunity right now. It is the World Food Prize that is going on, the Norman Borlaug Dialogues, the Borlaug Dialogues, as they call them. And we are having a bunch of people visiting Iowa specifically to celebrate both the importance of food around the world and helping to prevent food insecurity around the world. And that affects folks here in Iowa just the same as anywhere else. It just may look a little bit different. But today we're going to talk more about the logistics and the effects on the farm. And to do so, we have joining us Dr. Stephanie Mercier. She is the Senior Policy Advisor for the Farm Journal Foundation. And Dr. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us on the Iowa Ag Podcast.
My pleasure, David.
First off, can you give us just a bit of a background around yourself? You are, and you have done more than just the senior policy advisor position. What's kind of your background?
My career in agricultural policy is quite lengthy at this point in time. After I got my PhD from Iowa State, I ended up working at USDA's Economic Research Service on both domestic and trade policy issues for about 9 years, and then moved over to work on the staff of the Senate Agriculture Committee, most of that time working for Senator Harkin from Iowa. And during that period on the Ag Committee, we worked on two different farm bills, the 2002 Farm Bill and 2008 Farm Bill. Left the Ag Committee in 2011 and have been working with Farm Journal Foundation, which has more of an international focus, most of the time since 2014. So that's my background, my career in a thumbnail sketch. And
very strong background in agriculture,
yes.
And Iowa specifically,
yes.
As you mentioned. I think there's another good reason for you to be joining at the Iowa, joining here in Iowa for the World Food Prize.
Well, yeah, I am a native Iowan. I was born in Iowa City, lived in both Esterville and Ames as I was growing up. My parents were both on faculty at Iowa State, and I have a very strong affinity for agriculture and the way it's practiced here in the state of Iowa.
Well, Dr. Stephanie, part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you today is you have come out with an article recently with the folks there at Farm Journal talking about diversification on the farm and the impacts of diversification or lack thereof and what you've studied specifically on that topic. So let's just cover the broad scope of diversification. What is the scene now in modern 2025 versus historically in the U.S.?
Yeah, so this article is actually not commissioned by the Farm Journal Foundation, but by an outside group called the Agree Coalition. So not formally part of my work for Farm Journal Foundation.
Right. It was just something that I noticed was on their site as an opinion piece.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is a piece that looks at both what are the benefits derived from farmers adding, say, a third crop. Most Iowa farmers grow corn and soybeans on a rotational basis. If you can add a third crop, small grain like oats, millet, canola, you can improve the quality of the soil, you reduce runoff, you kind of diversify your income. I mean, I bet a lot of Iowa farmers who planted soybeans this year are wishing they maybe planted a few less soybeans and maybe a third crop that isn't running into the trade problems that soybeans are. Or, for example, bring livestock back in your operation, which is a way of diversifying it, which most Iowa farmers are not doing livestock anymore. They're just doing the two row crops. Or other examples of it are adding a perennial crop like alfalfa for cattle, for example, or adding a tree crop into your operation. All of those are considered ways of diversifying a farming operation, both from an economic point of view because you have more different sources of income, and from an environmental point of view because these are better crops from an environmental point of view in terms of soil health and things like that. So there's a lot of good reasons why farmer might want to consider one of these steps to make their operation a little more stable in terms of income. But there are also, and this is a main focus of this paper, there are a lot of barriers to the farmers who are thinking about making that kind of decision.
As you said, there's a lot of barriers to how this can function differently. But before we get into some of those barriers and some of the reasonings behind the potential that is involved in this, could you just talk about the why we're in the situation we are right now?
Yeah, well, for a very long time, farmers have been focused on producing, one or two crops or raising one livestock species because it's kind of simplifies the operation and they're being able to streamline and maybe capture some benefits of scale. So there were some good reasons in the past for doing this, and it's been a huge shift in, say, the last 50 years. Even in the last 20 or 30, I mean, there's a report that said that maybe in 1990, the average farming operation had 5 different activities. Now it's 2. And we know what that is in Iowa. That's corn and soybeans.
Absolutely.
But now we're looking at there being so many more different sources of risk out there than were contemplated maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So now it's maybe a good time to take a second look at whether or not your farm might be better off with a little more complicated operation, but a little more ways of dealing with risk.
I appreciate that point because it brings to mind the idea I've spoken with other people about, which is essentially with our technological advances in agriculture and in technology itself, we've been able to create a system that can rely on the strengths of certain geographical locations for the type of food that they can produce and can produce well. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why most of our fruits and vegetables will come from certain states that can grow them year round. And there's reasons why, here in Iowa, it's difficult to have a fruit or vegetable operation because there's only a few months you can actually produce that, even if you can produce it pretty well. So as you look at the efficiency aspect, how do you then balance the options and diversification aspect when you approach the study?
Well, so you're correct in that there are some parts of the country that have the kind of climate that will allow them to grow, say, strawberries or cucumbers or lettuce year-round. That's, mainly in the West, so California, Arizona, up in the Pacific Northwest, Florida, Texas to some extent. But there is room for production of those kinds of crops in other parts of the country. But the problem is that the distribution system has gone away. Midwest states like Iowa, like Indiana and Ohio, used to be really central locations for growing, like, say, green beans. Not for fresh market, but for canning.
Right.
Bird's Eye, for example.
Mm-hmm. Frozen or canned goods.
But that's kind of gone away because of some of the trade agreements we have access to some of that produce year-round, not just from California or Arizona, but from Costa Rica, Mexico, other places that have a climate that's either sort of opposite ours. They're in the southern hemisphere, so their crop is coming up at the time when we have snow on the ground. Or in terms of they're in the tropics, and so they just have that kind of climate year round. And so that canning industry that was very vibrant in say Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, say 20 or 30 years, mostly gone now. So there was room for both kinds, but a lot of that's been crowded out by imports at this point.
We'll touch on that in a moment, but let's go over the basis of this study and what you have learned and what you wrote about, mm-hmm. which involves the diversification of U.S. agriculture and pros and cons and what we've seen with that specifically. And when it comes to the diversification, you mentioned that we are doing much less in terms of, for example, Iowa producing primarily two big crops. What is some of the initial results that you got from what you looked at, and how then is that applied to what we were just talking about, where you have these opportunities in other countries or other states that they produce it instead?
Well, let's talk about the corn and soybean rotations that a lot of Iowa farmers are very comfortable. And some of them are actually just doing corn on corn, just corn all the time. The reason you want to add soybeans in there is because soybean is a legume, and it fixes nitrogen in the soil, which reduces the amount of artificial nitrogen fertilizer that you have to apply to your corn crop the next year. So there are agronomic reasons for that, in addition to the fact that both are pretty profitable crops that grow really well in Iowa. But what neither of them do very well is help build carbon content in the soil. And so that's why you keep having to add all these amendments to the soil when you're running that corn soybean rotation, because if you were to add a third crop that had better crop residue, better roots that allowed the soil to have more of that organic matter in it, you wouldn't need to do quite so much on the artificial side. So there are economic reasons because you're not spending the money on the inputs, and environmental reasons because soil health is not just good for the farmer, it's good for everyone else around them as well.
Using that point of example and going back to what we were talking about efficiency-wise, how do you then extend it? What else would be grown potentially here in Iowa that would, for lack of a better term, prevent farmers from having to have all their eggs in one basket?
Yeah. Well, even just a few decades ago, there were some farmers who grew oats in Iowa, for example. Production of oats in the United States has declined to such a level is that food manufacturers that want to use oats as a primary ingredient have to import most of their crops. Canada, for example, is where we get a lot of our oats now. And there have been some efforts to do some contracting with producers to grow oats that would then be delivered to food manufacturers who use that as an ingredient. But they're very small and still kind of preliminary. But that would be because if you grew more oats in the United States that was of the quality that's needed by those food manufacturers, then you're looking at starting to reduce that trade deficit that we've seen in agriculture over the last 4 or 5 years. So good for our farmers because they can get a premium for growing that crop. Good for the manufacturer because he's not having to buy imports and gets probably pays less on net because he's not having to ship it in. And good for the trade balance because you're growing those oats here rather than buying them from Canada.
My first thought when you were talking about that was the why. Why would we want to, say, for example, grow more oats? What does growing more oats do? Is there a demand for more oats? But I think a better question would be to go the route of incentives, because clearly it's worth it to other countries to grow oats and then send it over to the U.S. So what are incentives that would make growing oats less attractive here in Iowa?
A big part of the reason why oats acres have declined so much is that it is a program crop as considered under USDA. But the payment level, the support level for oats is far lower than it is for those other major crops we've been talking about. And if your oats crop has problems, if there's a disease or bad weather, and you lose that crop or you have a yield decline, there's not much of a safety net for you there. Whereas if you're growing corn and soybeans, you can run into similar problems. It's a very robust safety net for those crops. And that's part of the sort of the disincentive, the barriers to adoption that a lot of that paper that we're talking about gets into.
So the safety net is a huge incentive, you're saying, but why is it that, corn and soybeans, that is incentivized with safety nets, but something like oats or other potential small grains, which we have had historically, why are those not given similar safety nets then?
Well, I mean, it's a complex political question, but the basic reason is that the people who grow corn and soybeans and the other major crops have very strong influence on policymakers in Washington to make sure that their members are taken care of. And in order to improve the incentive, improve the payment rates for these minor crops, essentially they would see it as taking away from their producers to give them to other people. And there's a very, shall we say, strong aversion to losing what they consider their part of the Farm Bill.
As a small challenge to that, my question as a follow-up would be just, wouldn't the same people who are growing the corn and soybeans be the people who would be growing oats or other small grains? Wouldn't it just benefit them to have more options and have that be more wholesale as opposed to specific?
Yeah, but it wouldn't be in the interest of, say, the National Corn Growers Association to be advocating for oats production, or the American Soybean Association be advocating for canola production because that's not sort of their mandate from their members.
And that's just that's my point, because the members are supposedly just all farmers themselves.
And the farmers who might want to adopt those additional crops aren't necessarily as well organized as the ones who are, shall we say, committed to the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And small disorganized groups have much less pull in the policy process than those larger, very well organized and frankly well funded organizations.
Right. I guess the reason why, and once again, I'm just curious about this situation because it makes sense that the National Corn Growers would advocate for corn production, and the American Soybean Association would advocate for soybean production. That's their main role for a specific product. But at the top echelons of that, the presidents of both those associations, the members of all those associations are, sometimes mixed. I've seen, corn grower leaders who are then with the Soybean Association later on.
Some of them.
They're swapping around. They are benefited by having more choice when it comes to what they can produce.
There is no National Outgrowers Association.
Mm-hmm. And there never was, essentially.
No.
Or rather, it was so small that it just never really came to anything.
Never really caught on.
Okay. And
so there isn't that countervailing effort on behalf of these, we can call them minor crops because numerically they are. But there is no sort of concerted effort to try to place them on the policy agenda for a farm bill process, for example.
So I guess with that, my initial reaction would be then that they were small to begin with. So would growing them or having more opportunities for producers to grow those crops provide any meaningful change? Let's go over the diversification side of your article. How, in adding more, does that benefit farmers?
Well, it benefits them by, when you're just growing corn and soybeans, you're dependent on the success of those crops on the global markets. And if you add a third crop that isn't necessarily traded internationally, your prices are not going to be driven as much by what's going on internationally, and that's kind of a little bit of a safety net. And then that you've sort of diversified your income because you have a third crop that you're growing on your farm. Similarly with livestock, crop farmers are hurting right now. Livestock guys are doing pretty good, especially the beef market, cattle market. But there aren't a lot of farmers right now who are doing both. And so those gains, those benefits that are being enjoyed right now by the livestock industry are not passing over to the other parts of the sector.
So we discussed trade as one of the barriers.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go and return to, I said we'd put it away for a little bit. Let's bring it back. Barriers. What are the barriers then?
Okay, so we've talked about the commodity programs. Mm-hmm. Crop insurance is a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
There are like 140 different crops which have a federal crop insurance policy. Not all of them are created equal.
Right.
There are like 14 major crops that have what are called revenue policies that will protect you whether it's a yield loss that you're experiencing on your farm or revenue loss you're experiencing on your farm. And there's only 14 crops that have got that kind of policy. I personally call it the catalog of crop insurance. But because there's very significant data demands for groups that want to introduce, to get a new revenue policy for their crops, a lot of them just don't have the resources or, frankly, the planted acres of those minor crops in order to qualify for that. So the paper that we're talking about has a number of recommendations on ways to modify how we do crop insurance that would kind of level the playing field for those producers of minor crops.
Let's just talk about some of those recommendations then. What would some generic or some very easy to understand changes be for folks to hear about?
Well, for example, there's this one relatively new policy called whole farm revenue protection. And it was really put forward by people who raise horticultural crops because most of those folks raise a number of crops, not just one or two. And they wanted to make it easier to not have to provide individual records for every one of those crops, but just provide based on what revenues you're generating overall on your farm from all those operations. Problem with the whole farm revenue policy is not a lot of farmers know it's out there. and not a lot of agents want to sell it because it's very labor intensive for them, and they're not going to make much money by selling that policy, especially to a small scale producer. And so if we can figure out ways to provide an alternative kind of incentive to agents to offer this, to learn about it, because it's fairly complicated, and tell their customers about it, that would be a huge step in making that a more popular policy. Another area that's kind of interesting. There are policies for some minor crops that are available only in parts of the country. Say cereal rye being one, which is very popular as a cover crop. If you aren't in a state that has a policy for cereal rye, you're allowed to go to RMA and say, I want a written agreement to get that same policy for rye that's available in, say, Kansas or Missouri. But again, like with the whole farm revenue policy, not a lot of farmers know that's available. That's an option,
Right.
and not all agents know how to complete the process for that. So if you make that process easier and make it more well known that that's an option, then that's a good thing for these folks looking to adopt these third or fourth crops, these minor crops that we talked about. So those are two things I think can be done administratively by the risk management agency. I don't think Congress needs to weigh in on those.
You said something in that brought to mind another barrier that you've mentioned in here, and that is infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And in terms of infrastructure, I think immediately of one of the more recent examples, which was industrial hemp. There was a huge push to legalize industrial hemp, and there were many people in Iowa who gave it a shot. They tried it out. I remember the very first industrial hemp report that came out, and there was, not a lot, but a little bit. Mm-hmm. But 2 years later, the next report, there was virtually none.
Right.
And then it was gone after that. And the big reason behind it was there was no infrastructure. They could grow it. They could grow it extremely well. But where does it go after that? Who do they sell it to? Mm-hmm. Who stores it? Who buys it? None of that infrastructure was built at that point.
Right.
So how do you, A, recognize the infrastructure, lack thereof, and B, have a solution to dealing with that?
Well, part of the problem with the industrial hemp, and I followed this pretty closely at the time, infrastructure was part of it, and farmers didn't realize that they needed to really have production contracts, and not that there really wasn't an open market that they could sell that commodity on at the time. And so a lot of it ended up really just eating it.
Yeah.
But part of the reason why the infrastructure never developed is that the regulatory work that needed to be done to make it a more profitable crop never happened. Like, for example, in that initial 2014 Farm Bill that provided the authority for farmers to raise industrial hemp, there was a restriction that it could be no more than 0.3% THC content, which is the volatile part that makes a plant marijuana.
Right.
And that never got changed. And so if a farmer happened to produce a crop that was 0.5%, he had to destroy it, which kind of reduces the incentive.
Yeah.
And then there's other stuff like there was a strong expectation that hemp could be used as a feed ingredient. But the regulatory work by FDA and the other relevant agencies never got done. So that market is not yet available to those producers. So it's a combination of federal policy and the response by the industry. We don't have the regulatory certainty to do this, so we're not gonna buy this product.
Right.
And a lot of the barriers are sort of reinforcing of each other, not just the public policy stuff we've been talking about, but the markets and the infrastructure. You go to a country elevator here in Iowa, mainly what they're going to buy from you is corn and soybeans. They don't really have the bins or the setup to buy and process and ship out a third crop.
We've talked trade, infrastructure, both barriers to diversifying or allowing farmers to choose more on what they want to grow and what they view as a good business opportunity. But another aspect that has been very strong in the last 10 years, especially in Iowa, is conservation.
Yeah.
And there's been a huge increase in a lot of traditional conservation practices, but also cover cropping. And one of the cover cropping notes has been using small grains to sometimes will be grazed, and sometimes it's just used as this is a cheap holder of soil.
Yeah.
So what is the report and studies that you've done, and how has that impacted the diversification aspect?
Well, I am a big fan of the steps that were taken here in Iowa several years back when the state started offering a $5 an acre crop insurance discount to farmers who would adopt
The cost
crops.
shares.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was capped. And as far as I know, for the first several years, that cap got met almost immediately.
Right.
And they did increase the amount of cover crop acres in Iowa, which is a good thing. But it's well short of, it was roughly 1 million acres. There are 23 million acres of cropland in Iowa. And there's a standing report that looks at Iowa's contribution to runoff that has led to the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And those reports, which are several years old at this point, suggested that in order to really tackle that, you needed like 10 to 15 million acres of cover crop land in Iowa to make the sort of reductions in runoff that you needed. And we're, at 1 million, it was a good increase at the time, but it's still well short of what we need to do.
I think there's definite amounts of growth, and I believe I'd have to double check and fact check myself on this one, but I believe the last report from the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy said something along the lines of there were 3 to 4 million acres now.
Yeah, the number
Iowa. I recognize the number you're talking about were a few years ago.
Yeah.
Where that was a huge milestone. I just wanted to. I think that's the updated number, just for folks listening. I think that might be the current number.
The number I cited would have been out of the 2022 Census of Agriculture.
But there's still ways to go between 3 and 4 million to
10 to
15.
Yeah.
It's just going from almost none to that many in 10 years is a huge
and some of the same
increase.
barriers we've been talking about are part of the reason why more Iowa farmers haven't adopted cover crops. When you have a crop insurance policy, there are very strict rules about what you need to do with your cover crop when you're ready to plant that spring crop, whether it's corn or soybeans or something else.
Has that been a barrier for some of the small grains and using that as an extra crop?
Yeah, or even making them reluctant to plant cover crops because if they run into a weather problem in the spring and can't terminate the way they're supposed to, that could put their crop insurance on that spring planted crop at risk.
Right.
And there's also restrictions against using a cover crop, processing it for seed.
That's a pretty huge deal.
And it is something actually that we address in the recommendations is that we want RMA to take a look at how do they relax that restriction and make it easier for those farmers to harvest that seed, clean it, and make it available for sale to their neighbors, for example, which it would, because shortage of seed for cover crop is an issue in a lot of parts of the country. Cereal rye is available almost every place, but some farmers want to have a little more diverse mix of cover crop seed when they plant, and maybe put a legume in there or something like that to add more nitrogen. And those kinds of seeds are difficult to obtain in some parts of the country. So if you can relax that restriction in crop insurance, you might alleviate that problem.
I really like that idea because that is something that has been a barrier. Iowa's not typically known for being able to have the season to double crop, but with some of the small grains and you might be able to get something out of cover crops just being an expense. And farmers who do have who will graze on cover crops get their benefit. Yeah. But for a lot of other folks who don't have livestock, they don't necessarily have that opportunity.
And there's some places where farmers are having cover crops who don't themselves have livestock are essentially renting out that field to their neighbors who do have livestock. They can get a payment from them that reduces the feeding cost for that other farmer, but also defrays the cost of the cover crop to that first farmer. So there's ways you can make arrangements that can address that. But yeah, adding livestock, is a prime way of diversifying operations, and wish more farmers would think about going that direction.
What is the recommendation then for going in that direction? What prevents farmers here in Iowa from adding more livestock on their operation?
Well, I mean, a lot of farmers, especially ones who have been in the business for a while, are kind of reluctant to make substantial changes, not wanting to experiment. And that is an issue because, as you probably know, David, the average age of the U.S. farmer is 58, 59, 60 years old.
Right.
And so the ones who are still of an age who are willing to experiment a bit are still a fairly small part of the population. And probably a lot of those younger producers are already looking at some of these options or maybe have already adopted them. But we need to not just focus on the ones who already have adopted it, but how do we inform and work with those older farmers who have been reluctant to do this in the past and make the case for them that this is economically beneficial to them. And part of it would be working with the federal government to alleviate some of these barriers we're discussing.
There has been a huge emphasis put on value-added agriculture over the last decade as a way to combat chronically difficult economic situations for farmers. And I have viewed what your report has gone over as a similar measure. First off, before I continue my question, would you agree with that?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, diversifying means going from where you're relying on income from two crops to finding additional sources of income.
right.
And that can happen in any different ways. They don't necessarily involve the cropping operation. For example, I know that there are farmers who have set up their own sort of informal trucking operation and help their neighbors. They buy a semi and when their neighbors' crops are ready to be harvested and taken to the elevator, they hire their services out to that neighbor. That's a diversification of income
Right.
that isn't necessarily diversifying from an environmental point of view, but still is value added.
Right.
So there's a lot of overlap there, but not entirely.
There is. I know some farmers who do tiling as an operation where that they get hired to go tile some of their neighbors' land. And then looking at this as a value-added aspect of diversification, you create more value on your farm for doing or using similar amounts of land or property to just add more. There has been an emphasis because there is the lack of infrastructure and the barriers that we've discussed to simply diversify the use of products.
Yeah.
Corn and soybeans being the easiest example. There's a lot of different uses, and they find more and more uses for that. I guess my question would be, how is that different than what you're describing of having more options of things to grow or produce?
I mean, I think it's they're complementary sets of activities.
Okay. Yeah. I wasn't trying to say that one's good or one's bad. I was just curious.
The stuff we're talking about is mainly would be on the supply side.
Mm-hmm.
These are things that farmer is doing to, rather than just selling corn and soybeans to the local country elevator, he's going to have a third crop, or maybe he's going to have some cattle or some goats. I don't know. To market when it's ready to be sold. So that's the supply side, and I think there's a viable opportunity to pursue more of these expanded uses of these basic commodities. In fact, when I worked on the Senate Ag Committee, we had a provision added to the Farm Bill. This is when I was working for Senator Harkin, that instructed USDA to set up an office to look at providing bio-based products a priority status when products are being procured by agencies of the federal government. And I've not looked into this recently, but I think there's a real opportunity there, because who is a bigger buyer of basic products like paper towels, lubrication for vehicles than the U.S. government? And so I'm pretty sure that program is still there. I don't know how active it is, but that would be a move in the right direction, is to revitalize that set of activities.
I didn't think of it until you were talking about how you can use it as a complement to diversification. But are there any concerns over your research or in looking into this of what would happen if there was, suddenly a lot more diversification added? Would not certain crops like corn and soybeans that are high value, high demand, they would suddenly have fewer acres in the U.S., which means that, supply would go down, which means generally that prices would go up, which would then have folks maybe swap again back to corn and soybeans. Is there not something that the market would solve the problem that was intended to support them?
Okay, so corn and soybeans, there's a lot of different uses for it. Let's look at ethanol, for example, which is a big demander of corn right now. But there's really no reason why other grain crops can't be used as the feedstock for ethanol. We use corn because it's abundant, and it's located it's being grown near where these ethanol plants are. But there's really no reason why that fundamentally, from the operational point of view, why they couldn't use sorghum or barley or another grain crop. Or, if we can finally figure it out, let's use cellulosic material, because there's a lot of that with corn.
Absolutely, yes, stover.
Or the same thing with soybean oil. That's a major feedstock for biodiesel. It's not the only one you can use. Canola, other forms of oilseeds are valuable. So you're not necessarily going to drive those complementary business out of business because they can use other things. And you're going to lift all the boats there. It's going to be if you start moving. If you start moving, 5-10 million acres out of corn and soybeans into other crops, yeah, you'll see a dump in corn, but not so much that you're going to price those markets out of that crop. And if it starts moving even higher, then they can look at these other sources of grain or oilseeds as feedstocks. So the markets will recalibrate.
To conclude our conversation, I have 100 more questions I could easily ask, but I want to be respectful of your time during the World Food Prize, that you have plenty of opportunities to get to where you need to get going. But to conclude your research, your report, and also just what we've discussed today, what is your hope moving forward then for allowing diversification, promoting diversification, and giving farmers the opportunity to build their business around more than the basic couple choices they've been given?
Yeah, well, and that's why we were so pointed in the policy recommendations in the paper towards kind of pushing Department of Agriculture primarily to take a look at their programs to see if we can tweak them a bit and make it easier for producers of these minor crops to get access to the facilities they need. For example, Midwest grain elevators are mainly configured to handle corn and soybeans.
Right.
So it would be fairly costly for them to add a bin that what a lot of them do.
Different storage, yeah.
But if you look at grain elevators in, say, Kansas or Colorado, those are usually handling grain, wheat, which is a small grain. So if you add cereal rye, that's not as big a cost in terms of retrofitting that operation. So let's do some pilot programs with authority that's probably already there to see how feasible those kinds of changes are. So there's a lot of things that USDA, if they can get on the bandwagon here and recognize, if they really are farmer first, which is what Secretary Rollins keeps talking about, let's look at these kinds of opportunities.
More opportunities available for farmers, all discussed. Could you once again talk about this report specifically, if there were people who wanted to look it up and see some of the results themselves?
Yeah, so the report is available on the website for the Agree Coalition. So I would just suggest Googling Agree, spelled AGREE, Coalition on the internet, and you're going to find that report there.
Dr. Stephanie Mercier is with us. She is the Senior Policy Advisor for the Farm Journal Foundation. Dr. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us on the Iowa Ag Podcast.
It's my pleasure, David.
And we are grateful for you joining in on the first revival of the Iowa Ag Podcast. Again, I'm your host, David Geiger, and looking forward to having more of these conversations ahead of us. This is the Iowa Ag Podcast at the Jethro's Barbecue Studio. Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, David Geiger. Please feel free to check out another podcast I do, Farm Here Daily. You can find it on all the main platforms. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. See you next week, everybody.